This is Cold Start.
And after we had a conversation with Tim Barber, who was our most recent guest, I think we got a little itch to go check out some sprint cars. And funny enough, in Northern California, there was a return to a pretty famous dirt track that's here in Napa County, of all places. Everyone thinks about Napa County as wine country and tourist and wine tasting and all that good stuff. But there's actually a great sprint car track up there.
Yeah, as far as racing, people think of Sonoma Raceway, that's Northern California, maybe Thunder Hill Raceway a little further afield. But here we're talking about Calistoga Speedway, a beautiful track, actually, located right in the middle of Napa, but one that hasn't been used for a while. It's been about 5 years since the last race there, and we had an opportunity and the privilege to catch the Louis Vermeil Classic sprint car races at Calistoga Speedway. Louis Vermeil was a famous figure in sprint racing, contributed a lot to the sport, was a series director for a while, and kind of like in NHRA drag racing, they have the Wally, named after Wally Parks. They have the Louis Trophy for sprint car racing. So it was pretty cool. We went out to go see the races there. It was two different series that were competing. There was the USAC or CRA series, which is the California Racing Association along with the U.S. Auto Club. USAC has been around forever, really well-known, really well-respected organization. And then there's the group called the Northern Auto Racing Club, or NARC, which is a West Coast-oriented sprint car racing sanctioning body. So these were the groups who were there putting on the sprint car races that night. And what a cool scene it was. It was my first time ever experiencing sprint cars or sprint car racing up close and personal. And wow, it was something totally different and kind of lit me up in a way I didn't expect.
Yeah, so Calistoga Speedway, it's been a pretty prominent track in the NorCal region, and not a lot of people think about California in terms of circle track and dirt track racing. But California has been a proving ground of developing some pretty famous drivers, and Calistoga, they had their last race before this race that we had most recently back in 2019. And Calistoga Speedway kind of fell into a state of disrepair. And a lot of people thought that the county was actually going to take over the property and mow it down and turn it into something else. Like a lot of racetracks, unfortunately, come to their early demise in doing so. And fortunate enough, there was a handful of individuals and investors that dumped a bunch of money into Calistoga Speedway and revived the track. And let me tell you, being able to go back, I remember growing up in Northern California in Sonoma County and going to these races as a very young kid, and kind of developed an interest and passion in motorsport because of Calistoga Speedway. So being able to return years later to be able to watch sprint cars once again was an awesome experience. And like you said, it was your first time. You had never experienced sprint cars. After we talked to Tim Barber, we had some conversations about sprint car racing and why it's such a unique and interesting form of motorsports. And after you said that you had never been to one, and I was mentioning, I was like, I might go to this Calistoga thing. Cars are coming back for the first time in, over 5 years. You showed interest of, I want to check these things out.
I was super stoked. Everything I've heard about sprint car racing sounded borderline terrifying. Like the people out there racing are like modern day gladiators in these overpowered, maybe under-engineered or over-engineered cars. We'll talk more about those in a few minutes. And super grassroots. Dirt track racing, dirt track ovals and circle tracks exists in a space that seems like a parallel universe in a way. Those of us who pay attention mostly to road course racing, circuit tracks, have very little idea for the most part about these dirt tracks that are out there, and there are quite a few. And so to be able to kind of witness firsthand this grassroots type experience of motorsports and racing at a place where Calistoga is mostly known for having some, luxurious resorts and spas, for their springs, Calistoga Springs, the water that comes from there, and much less for racing. So it was really exciting to me to have an opportunity to go to such a cool place and check out this form of racing that's been around well longer than I've been paying attention to, and to get to witness it up close and personal in a way that you need to do if you're going to check out sprint car racing.
And I think the evening that we spent at Calistoga, I think you got the full experience of sprint cars in general. Like you were talking about, there was two different series that were there, so we got to see winged sprint cars and non-winged sprint cars. We'll go more into the history of how these cars developed and came to be and have become, frankly, maybe one of the most popular forms of motorsports in the United States. But we got to see both of those vehicles compete. we also got to see some pretty glorious crashes and incidents that occurred. I mean, the racing that occurred that night was absolutely unbelievable. And Calistoga as a track amongst dirt ovals has a pretty unique shape. And that's why a lot of people were so excited that this track got saved, where a lot of dirt ovals or dirt tracks, they're typically almost circular in the way that you can run them, where Calistoga, it's like a paperclip, meaning you have these long straightaways, but these very tight hairpin corners on each side, which creates a unique style of racing. In a sprint car, points where you actually have to use the brakes, which is not always the case when you run, especially winged cars on dirt. So Calistoga develops this very interesting racing style as well. But yeah, we almost closed the night out with an absolutely spectacular incident that occurred right in front of us. The total bicycle flipping end over end. We were right dead center in the whole thing. So great introduction for you of getting into sprint cars, of what is wrong with these guys and why the hell do they get in these cars?
Yeah, where this started was I heard about sprint car racing. I'm like, wait a minute. So there's sprint races, which are kind of one driver all out for some period of time. Like you see a Formula One race, they call that a sprint race. Or there's endurance racing where you'd have multiple drivers hopping in and out of the vehicle over a longer period of time, maybe many hours. This is neither of those. The car itself is called a sprint car, irrespective of the format in which they're actually racing. And these things go back to like the 1930s when they were still doing, I think you were telling me about this board track racing. Can you tell us a little bit more about how sprint cars came about, where we would have seen these in the past, and sort of how we got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this goes back all the way to the early 1900s. I mean, you have to imagine what these cars looked like back in the day. It was basically 4 wheels, a frame, a motor, and a seat, right? Now, board racing is a whole other interesting conversation we could do a whole episode on. But basically, back in the day, they would make these high-banked oval tracks out of wood, out of 2x4s. Like, they looked like the banking, the bracing looked like the underside of a roller coaster. Like, unbelievable, right? Super, super dangerous. A lot of people got hurt doing it. Look into the history of board racing back in the day. It's unbelievable. So as more and more people started dying, drivers, spectators, all this sort of stuff, the racing kind of moved away and moved to fairgrounds. Now, fairgrounds, as we think about them nowadays, a lot of them have, horsing racetracks or horsing ovals. And so they started racing the cars on the dirt ovals. And so this transitioned a period and getting more into what we know now as dirt track racing and circle track racing with these sprint cars. Now, the whole essence of sprint cars and why even board racing became so popular was the ethos behind sprint cars was a cheap and accessible way to go racing comparative to, the professional racing series that were going on during the days. This was a way that anyone could go and do it. And so sprint cars in its inception was very popular amongst farmers, mechanics, small town individuals, where they essentially would take car chassis of the day and just try to make them as light and as fast as possible. Now, of course, we imagine if you take, something that doesn't have safety equipment to begin with, and you make it lighter, faster, and more agile, and you start racing it on dirt ovals that maybe weren't intended for cars in the first place, there was a lot of incidents that were occurring. Spectators were getting killed. At some point, there needed to be an adult in the room, a sanctioning body, to help kind of control this whole development of a new type of race car. Interestingly enough, the first sanctioning body that got involved with quote-unquote sprint cars was AAA, like the insurance company.
The Automobile Association?
Yeah, the insurance AAA that we know nowadays, they were the first ones to get involved of okay, we need some rules and regulations and control this whole sport that's starting to blow up. And now a huge growth that occurred with sprint cars was post-World War II. That's where we saw a big surgence kind of come to play. The terminology sprint car kind of came more into the conversation. And after World War II, all of these soldiers that were coming back from fighting in war were looking for an activity, a pastime that could make them feel something like the heart of battle made them feel something.
You need that adrenaline.
And so they started getting into sprint car racing, which, it was always this very dangerous thing in the very beginning because these cars didn't have full containment seats like we think about in modern day race cars. There weren't harnesses. There weren't seatbelts. I mean, basically, if these cars went over or started to flip, which was very common in the era, you basically were launching drivers onto the track.
Yeah, my understanding was the point of view of the drivers, they didn't want seatbelts because if there was a rollover or some kind of problem, they wanted to be thrown free of the vehicle. They didn't want to get pinned underneath this car if it was to flip over or wind up in a bad situation. So they actively promoted against things like seatbelts or harnesses to hold them in when they started out. And if you think back to the early days of like the Indy 500, what those cars look like with their exposed open wheels on the sides and the kind of car that you described, Sylas, these cars ran in the Indy 500, right? Coming up, you were talking about early days of what they called Champ Car, and there was overlap quite a bit with this platform that eventually evolved into what we call sprint cars today.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was these cars. I mean, sprint cars in general of that era were basically open wheel, front engine, because we think about Indy cars nowadays, they're mid-engine, right?
Right.
So these Champ cars were the front engine roadsters, and there was cases where drivers would run dirt ovals in a season, and then they would go off and they would do the Indy 500. And this was back in the day when like motorsports kind of like intermixed for the most part, and the cars already looked very similar to begin with. There wasn't this like big distinction of the car types. And there was eras where you could run your sprint car on dirt ovals, you could run the Indy 500, and then, oh wait, yeah, you could also do this thing called Pikes Peak. Like there was this whole kind of interconnectivity, and in Pikes Peak, that's why there was the open wheel class. It was essentially these Champ cars, which were also essentially sprint cars. This is loose terminology. I don't want to get yelled at by some like USAC diehards of like, well, technically that car was this and this era. There's all these different like little subsets that occur, but for the most part, that's the sort of cars that we're talking about.
And where these came up, you said they were popular with farmers and kind of this grassroots form of motorsports. When they first came out, these cars are kind of like a tractor, right? There's effectively hillbilly engineering going on here, which is to say things that were built out of simple mechanicals. They wanted to go fast. They kept them lightweight. They didn't want to be overly complicated. And that's sort of the ethos behind these cars and still how they exist today. The first thing I thought was pretty interesting is their direct drive. These cars don't actually have a transmission. It's just a spline, a shaft-driven system that just interfaces with the rear end of the car. It doesn't actually have a clutch. It doesn't have any way to engage other than to turn the wheels.
Talking about like these farmers and stuff, so like back in this 1930s growth that occurred, sprint cars were really popular in Pennsylvania, Iowa, Indiana, and even California. Even in the early days, California was on the list of where these cars were developed. And like you're talking about, because they're farmers, because these were small town individuals making these race cars, they would kind of use, back in those days, anything they had laying around.
Yeah,
right?
Parts on hand.
And so like these early days sprint cars, they had solid front axles. Now it's not an all-wheel drive driven car, but just like a tractor has a solid front axle, so did sprint cars. It was kind of anything you could find and use to make something just strong enough to withstand and light enough to perform. That's what you used. And like the steering componentry in these early days sprint cars looked and were very similar to the steering componentry that were in tractors. Now the funny thing, this is fast forwarding to the modern day cars, a lot of this stuff is still in the vehicles. Like even through the generations, sprint cars in regards to technology didn't develop all that much. They still today have solid front axle. They still today have very simplistic steering componentry. And I guess the best way to cover the ethos or the way that they design these cars is it's redneck over-engineering, where it's not over-engineered in its complexity. It's very simplistic. It's over-engineered in regards to how strong it needs to be because these things basically go to battle, right? You don't want anything to break. You think about a formula car, modern-day F1 car, very sophisticated but very fragile. This is almost on like the complete other end of the spectrum of like make it as simple as possible, but make it be able to withstand anything.
Yeah, these cars, the seating position is so unusual. When I looked at one of these cars, it's like you're sitting, I have to say, like on a bar stool or like on a living room chair. It's upright. It's not laid back like a formula car. It's not crouched down in any way. It's like you're sitting upright.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are the modern cars that we're talking about. These are what they race in today. There was no development for creature comforts in regards to the cabin. We talk about modern day race cars like GT cars where it's like, oh, they have helmet blowers now and they have air conditioning and they have nice comfortable padding seating. These modern day sprint cars still have this very rudimentary seating position like you're talking about, where your back is almost completely upright and the angle to your legs is past 90 degrees, where, yeah, your heels are behind your kneecaps in the seating position of this vehicle.
I mean, what an uncomfortable way to sit for any period of time, let alone in a race car.
Everyone's probably like, well, why don't they make it different? Well, it's like, well, you want to make it as small and as light as possible. So, like, the idea is not for the comfortability of the driver. You're trying to make the driver compartment as small as possible because that's going to make the overall vehicle short and nimble and lightweight. So the way that these cars are, and if you ever look at a side shot of a sprint car, you basically have the motor, which is essentially to the kneecaps of where the driver is. There's a firewall separating the motor from the driver. But then you're straddling the torque tube or the output shaft that basically drives the rear tires. And then on the back of the driver is the fuel. So like you're basically jammed between the engine and the fuel supply as the driver of a sprint car, and you're straddling what is the drive shaft of the vehicle that's spinning. I mean, there are braces and things like that in case it does come apart, that it's not getting into the cabin of the vehicle. But the driver is kind of like the least of the worries when they were designing these cars. And I think that's what's kind of cool about sprint cars in general is like, no, it's just the gnarliest thing ever. Like, we're not going to water it down even over these decades of sprint cars existing. I mean, you know, the kind of modern day looking sprint car kind of started coming out in the 70s and the 80s. Like the form and the shape of the car kind of looked more like the modern cars. There hasn't been big changes since then.
Yeah, these are really stripped down, sort of narrow vehicles where all that was there was what was necessary. And you talk about the driver having to straddle the drive shaft itself. One pedal on the left side, another pedal on the right side, and you had to manage between these. But these aren't the kind of pedals you think of in modern cars. They're not hung pedals. They're not hinged pedals. They're sort of a swing arm and a vertical up and down. How does that work?
Obviously, you can't transition your feet across where the drive shaft would be in the sprint car. And so on the left side, you have your brake arm. I wouldn't even call it a pedal because it's not like the pedal we think about of this thing that we push on. It's basically a swing arm down and a metal bar that comes down to where your toes would be. And you basically push on that forward, and that's going to be your brakes for the sprint car. Now on the right side, that's where the gas is going to be. And now the gas is a straight down motion. Once again, it's mostly a bar. It's not an actual pedal. And there's a spring on it, so that way it can limit getting a hung throttle. It'll spring back up. But basically, you have this bar underneath your foot and a bar above your foot, and it's an up-down motion. So with your right foot on the gas, up and down, your left foot on the brake, forward and back.
What a weird position. I mean, think about the throttle's probably the most important thing you have to control how this car goes, the speed of this car. And it's not been engineered in any way for ergonomics or for the benefit of the driver. It's just a thing that's there that you need to be able to reach and sort of interact with. And you're down on this thing an awful lot of the race, right? I mean, it's full throttle a good portion of, certainly for the straights.
Not to talk too much about the driving dynamics of a sprint car, because I've never been behind the wheel of a sprint car or a dirt car or a sprint car on dirt. But basically these cars, you drive them with the throttle. That's how you get them to turn. The steering wheel is just kind of a directional thing. To actually get the cars to rotate is very much with the throttle. Now, the brake pedal is equally important. Now, the funny thing with sprint cars and where the rear rotor is located for the brake, it's essentially underneath your seat. Now, these seats that they sit in, for the most part, are fully metal containment seats. And so if you use the brake too much, you can actually start to overheat the rear rotor, and the sparks that can come off the rear brake are just going to go straight into the bottom of your seat, and you can start to essentially boil your rear end. Your rear end, your personal rear end, not the car's rear end, your own rear end in the seat if you're using the brake too much. So if there's not an incentive to stay off the brakes and go as fast as possible, there's an additional one for you. So the whole cockpit and the ergonomics for the driver of this vehicle just seems so alien. And I think that's what's so interesting is that within terms of racing, what I found was a lot of road course racers, people that are into Formula cars, NASCAR. Well, NASCAR maybe knows more about this category than most, but like GT style racing, IMSA, endurance, whatever it is, not a lot of people who are professional race car drivers know too much about sprint cars, which kind of blew my mind of like, I always saw it as like this grassroots, like very true form of motorsport, but not a lot of people know about it. And so when you see the interior of a sprint car for the first time, you're like, who the hell is signing up for this?
It's such a weird way this is sort of hiding in plain sight among the racing community, and there's the people who know, and there's the people who haven't yet gotten to experience it. Just to give you an idea further of how driver unfriendly these cars are, right? They're really all about the speed and the performance. We didn't mention, but there are no mirrors on these cars. You don't have a rear view mirror, you don't have side view mirrors, and there's no spotter telling you, oh, there's a car on your high side or there's a car next to you. You just have to develop a feel for these things. The inside of the car itself, you're basically completely enveloped in this roll cage, this tube chassis that goes all around your body. You have arm restraints on because it would be really dangerous for your arm to fly out the side. I can't even call it a window, but the side of the car. You're wearing your harness belts and your helmet and your Hans and all this stuff in this really uncomfortable position on this metal seat that's getting hot, in this position where it's even hard to move your legs, let alone control this throttle and this brake. You also have staggered tires. Let's talk about that a little bit. So on a dirt track or an oval or a circle track, you're going all in the same direction. Generally, you're going left all throughout this thing. And these cars aren't really set up. It sounds funny, but they're not really set up to go in a straight line. The tires from rear to front and from left to right are staggered. So you have two different size tires on your rears and two different size tires on your fronts. Do you want to talk about the driving dynamics of that a little bit? You've been in a car that's set up this way.
Yeah, so I mean, you can change the amount of stagger that the car has. Like, this is an adjustability factor for how the car handles, but essentially on that rear axle, your right rear is going to be larger or taller than your left rear. And just like thinking about a spinning top or something that kind of leans over, it's going to want the car to turn left. It's just going to help it turn left. So everything about these vehicles are built in such a way to help it go left, which that also means that it hates to go straight. And so this is also like Calistoga, throwing it back to Calistoga Speedway, is a challenging track, is because there's a point in time that you have to make the thing go straight. Sprint cars just love to be sideways. As soon as they get sideways, especially on the dirt, it feels comfortable. That's where the car wants to be. That's where the car is spending most of its time during a lap around the track. But on those straight lines, you're fighting the thing all the way down the straightaway until you can set it sideways into the next corner.
Kind of the mindset here is go fast through the corners as fast as possible. And in a way, this is no different than road racing, right? Where we've used aerodynamics, downforce, wings, all these devices on the car to help get it more downforce, get it more grip through those turns so that you can go faster. Because in the straightaways, it's just a matter of how much engine power do you have, and do you have enough to overcome those aerodynamics. So in this case, you're watching these cars that are designed effectively for cornering most of the time. And Calistoga being unusual, and for my first experience seeing these sprint cars, I didn't realize how unusual this was, but having effectively this straightaway, watching cars have a really hard time keeping it straight. You're seeing a lot of drifting and steering adjustments sort of left to right when they're going down the straight part of the racetrack. When they hook up into the corners, they seem much more sort of in their element and able to manage these things. And partly that is because of the staggered setup of the tires from side to side and from front to back. The car wants to turn in and grip in and get into those turns in such a way that it can maximize the speed through the turns. It's really cool to watch. There's a drift dynamic to these things as they go around that's just almost continuously through the lap. The car is at least scrubbing some slip angle to the side, even when it's going in a straight line.
Now, to talk further about kind of the separation of different types of sprint cars. So sprint car encompasses the category of essentially the chassis, the size of the chassis. Now, there's a handful of different types of sprint cars, different subsets, different divisions for sprint cars. Now, originally, sprint cars were always non-winged. So whenever you say sprint car, that means it does not have wings on it. So a lot of people think about sprint cars, they might think about the ones that have the massive picnic table style wings on the roof as well as the front end. But whenever you say sprint car, that means non-winged. So when you want to talk about a winged sprint car, you have to say winged before sprint car. So the wings came into play in the late 1950s. And there was an individual in Ohio that went to, I believe it was Columbus Speedway, and decided to put a wing on the top of his sprint car. And this was, no one else was running this, and it added a little bit of stability. Obviously, we know aerodynamics and downforce and pushing the vehicle down into the pavement. And he was able to be somewhat successful with his wing on the top of his sprint car. And so more and more people picked up on, hey, I want to run the wing. And that seems to be a little bit more stable and handle higher speed tracks a little bit better. And so later it became more and more popular until around the 1970s, they decided to develop their own sanctioning body to encompass winged sprint cars. Now, before that, USAC was the sanctioning body that was managing all of the non-winged or normal sprint cars. And so this other sanctioning body came in of people that wanted to run wings, and that was the World of Outlaws. So whenever people talk about sprint cars, they might have heard the term World of Outlaws, and that was the racing series, national racing sanctioning body for winged cars. Now, the separation between winged and non-winged, the winged cars obviously are significantly faster in the corners. They're more under control, if that's even a term we can use. And to kind of like put the emphasis on like, if you run a non-winged sprint car on dirt, you're kind of like the crazier person. NASCAR, even when they were signing drivers into their contracts during this era that sprint cars were really, really popular, they would actually write into these contracts that their drivers were not allowed to run non-winged sprint cars because of the danger, because of the non-winged cars are a lot more unstable and can flip a lot easier and cause a lot of injuries. And sprint cars do cause a lot of injuries. Even nowadays, there still are deaths that can occur from sprint car racing, and the winged ones are seen as a little bit more stable. The wing is also seen as a crash structure, funny enough, that when the cars go upside down, rather than the cage hitting the dirt and hitting the ground first, the wing can actually act as like a crumple zone and absorb a lot of that energy. So these winged cars, even though that they're faster around the track, are seen as more stable and potentially safer than the non-winged cars.
And to give you an idea, again, all this goes back to that sort of originating philosophy of keeping things straightforward and simple and using the components that we knew how to manage on hand. You're effectively driving around in this roll cage structure. For those that are uninitiated, I might say it looks sort of like an overgrown roller skate that's really narrow and a little tall, that's all engine up front and these giant tires on the sides and the back. And if you think about it, it's really set up to be pretty dangerous. The position of the driver, the whole activity itself. I think it's been called one of the most dangerous forms of short track racing sports. And then further, they have fewer regulations, right? Again, to kind of keep it simple, to keep it stripped down. The amount of rules, if you looked at the rule book for one of these sanctioning organizations compared to a comparable NASCAR, IndyCar, something that we think of for more modern sports, it's a fraction of the amount of rules and guidelines necessary for these things to operate in a racing series. So when I talked about earlier on, these are like modern day gladiators. The people who are out there racing these things are in a dangerous circumstance for the pleasure and the experience of the people who are spectating, maybe the team owners who put people out in their cars to go see them drive around, generally not the people who are out there driving. And it's dangerous, and that is part of the thrill for going out to see these things. In adding to the danger, these are alcohol-fueled cars. So alcohol and methanol is the fuel of choice because of their high energy content for the sprint cars to be able to produce the kind of power that we're talking about. And the kind of power is 700 to 900 horsepower in this car that weighs anywhere between 1,100 and 1,450 pounds, including the driver, including the fuel. So if you just wrap your head around the amount of power that you have there. Earlier, I think I misspoke when I said, it's just throttled down all the time. I think a lot of these cars are so powerful that they can't go full throttle. Like full throttle will actually just burn up the tires and overpower the car to the point where they're not going to be able to turn in the places where they need to turn. So keep that in mind. These kind of cars are prone to catching on fire as well, we should mention. So the idea of wearing a fire suit, the material called Nomex, right, for all the shirts and socks and underwear and everything that people have underneath their fire suits. That's also a very important element of this activity. So if we haven't given you the picture yet that this is sort of something for the risk takers, something that's dangerous going in. I mean, it's even a little dangerous for the spectators because occasionally what will happen is these cars going at extremely high speeds, over 100 miles an hour, through turns, let alone down the straights, will occasionally bump into each other, not all that uncommonly. They're racing around on dirt. The dirt moves underneath the tires of the car. The cars are moving around. They're sliding around. Occasionally, these cars will flip over and exceed the boundaries of the racetrack. All around these racetracks, generally, there's this fence they call a catch fence. And the idea of that is if something was to flip over and kind of bounce up, the car would be caught. Occasionally, the cars will go up and over those and land over into some spectator part of the racetrack. So they can be really dangerous for everybody involved. And again, that's part of the excitement. That's part of the experience. But, nobody wants to go to a race and have a car land on top of them. So it's intended to be and designed to be something that's protecting the cars to keep them within the boundaries of the racetrack. But occasionally, things go off plan.
Yeah, I always say that sprint cars within America is probably one of, if not the last true form of motorsport. And it's kind of sick and cynical to say that motorsport needs an element of danger, but that's how it's been throughout history. Motorsports and racing vehicles has always been a dangerous activity, and that's the appeal, right? I mean, talking about that comparison to Gladiators, there was a reason why it drew so many people to go watch the Gladiators, was that element of danger, people putting their lives on the line. And I say that sprint car racing is the last true form of motorsport because there still is that very much high risk that something can go wrong. And if it goes wrong bad and in a serious way, there are real consequences still. Where most other racing, there's been so much push towards safety and rebuilding racetracks and rebuilding cars and this whole thing, there isn't that necessary element of danger anymore with modern day road course racing, which also leads to drivers just making stupid mistakes and making unnecessary risk. When you go and watch sprint car racing, those drivers, when they're making a decision to potentially take a risk to make a pass, they know that there is that other side where if they make a mistake or they touch or they don't leave enough room, that they could be put in a situation that they could get seriously hurt. And even on the spectator side, kind of that little tinkly juices flowing, you're even in danger that something could happen or a car could bicycle and exit the stadium. I mean, sprint car wrecks are probably the most spectacular wrecks that you could see. Look them up on YouTube. There's plenty of compilations. But these cars can wreck on their own without notice, right? They can catch an edge on the dirt and just start flipping like crazy. And it takes a 1-2 bounce and these things can go over, a 10, 15 foot fence. It's unbelievable.
We're not trying to glorify the danger of this, the danger to human life that exists with these things. But if you go back to the origins of motorsport became a thing because we created these machines that were so much more powerful and capable than what humans can do on their own, right? Otherwise, I think we'd all be getting really excited about going out to the velodrome, watching bicycles race in an oval or a circle, and people go do that.
Yeah.
But there's nowhere near the level of excitement, potential for, all kinds of unexpected outcomes as when we increase the amount of power these things had when we created powered vehicles, combustion vehicles. So take that to the fullest extent now, strip away everything that's not necessary, increase the power to the maximum level that you can in such a small footprint, give the drivers just enough what they need to control the vehicle to the best of their ability, and then hang on tight. It's a wild ride for everybody involved. And I had so little appreciation for this until I saw this up close and personal. And it's not just about wrecks. Let's be very clear. It's about the sound of these cars.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the fact that they're kicking up dirt into the air and it's floating all around and it feels like you're participating in this race even if you're just spectating. The speed at which and the rate at which these cars are lapping the racetrack. If you can believe it, these are cars that are going to circle a 1/2 mile oval in about 16 seconds. So it's a lot of quick swings of the head to watch things go by and then watch them come back around again. The dynamics are just so exciting. It's hard to do anything but be engaged in what's going on all around you as you kind of spin your body around or spin your head around to watch a car or multiple cars kind of coming through a turn and waiting to see who gets the grip and who doesn't get the grip. One of the things maybe we should talk about a little bit more are the variations of types of sprint cars. We talked about sort of the origins and derivations, but there are different size sprint cars, different power level sprint cars. Can you walk us through that, Sylas?
Yeah, so sprint cars, we're talking about, the 900 horsepower cars, which are essentially a NASCAR motor, like you're talking about in this lightweight chassis. Those are going to be 410s. That's going to be the maximum power. So 410 is representative of the cubic inch allowance for the motor's size. Now, there's smaller engine-sized classes for sprint cars, which there's the 360, and then there's even a 305. So a 305 sprint car, these are all the same size chassis, just different motors that go into them.
And to give you a comparison point, when you hear 410 cubic inches, I don't think a lot of people have a reference point for what that is. That's a 6.7-liter engine, right? That's the upper bound of anything you'd see on any road-going car, and it would be a damn powerful one at that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sound that 410s produce, they're wound up to the 9. They're making an insane amount of horsepower. They're running off of alcohol. It is just raw power in all of the sense of the word. And so the 410 is kind of the top of the line sprint cars. Those are going to be the fastest ones. And then there's the 360s and the 305s. Less power, more for the introductory, but they're using the exact same chassis. Different series will permit different engine sizing and things of that nature. Now, sprint car, that is like the standard size. That's what everyone talks about. Now, there are different sized chassis that kind of go into the same category of racing. So the smaller ones are known as midgets. They're a little bit smaller. Different engines that go into those, less horsepower, that sort of thing. Then there's also micros, which are even smaller. And then you can also get in down further to very, very entry-level sprint car style of basically karts, like go-karts that go on dirt, and they can have the wings on them or don't have the wings. And so there's this great lineage that can happen of getting into circle track racing, single-seater style dirt track racing that you can grow through of, the karts, the micros, the midgets, the sprints. And then even on the larger end, there are things called Silver Crown cars.
Yeah, I wanted to know more about that Silver Crown thing. What's that about?
So Silver Crowns, that was known as like the upper echelon of dirt racing. That was like the marquee series to get into.
And that was with USAC.
So Silver Crowns only existed in USAC because Silver Crowns, unlike sprint cars, were only non-winged. There was no such thing as a winged Silver Crown. And so the Silver Crown, comparative to a sprint car, was just 18 inches longer in the chassis and larger engines, more power, faster. Basically, that's what a Silver Crown is. Silver Crown's not as popular nowadays. Whenever anyone talks about these cars, they normally talk about sprint cars, especially the winged cars. The winged cars are usually the most popular, the most watched on television. That is kind of like the marquee series, if you think about it nowadays, is winged sprint car 410.
And if it wasn't clear enough that these things were sort of a little precarious, you're basically sitting on a fuel can. The cars that weigh 1,150 pounds, they have approximately 30 to 33 gallon fuel tanks, right? If you do the math on that, that's something like 200 pounds of gas of your 1,100 pounds. And that's including the driver, by the way. In the Silver Crown cars, those weigh somewhere up to like 1,450 pounds or so. Those have 60 to 70 gallon fuel tanks. So you can imagine this contraption, how much room it would even take to hold all that fuel. Knowing the engines are out front, that means the fuel tanks are out back.
Essentially strapped to your back. And so, if you wrecked and it burst the bladder, fire was a big concern and is a big concern with sprint cars. Even at Calistoga, when we were there during qualifying, one of the cars caught on fire and the driver had to jump out and roll around on the track. And thankfully enough, fire safety was there very, very quickly to extinguish him. And so everything was fine and he was completely okay. But yeah, fire is a big concern in these cars. And I think Silver Crown cars, I may be incorrect with this, but I believe the Silver Crown series would run longer races. And so they needed larger fuel supply to be able to run longer races, longer events.
And another aspect of the danger here, if you've never seen anybody catch on fire from alcohol-based fuel, you need to go look on YouTube for methanol fires because the flames are invisible. What you'll see is somebody struggling to get out of a vehicle, getting out and basically rolling around on the tarmac or the dirt because they're trying to put out the flames that are not visible to anybody else. So you really need a well clued in crew sitting there with fire extinguishers, with the appropriate safety gear in case there is such a circumstance, because it might not be obvious or apparent to anybody else watching. Maybe only the driver is fully aware of that. It's a scary thing.
Yeah. So it just always fascinates me. Like, sprint cars to me, like, are the coolest thing ever. And every time you go to a sprint car event or a sprint car race, it's always cool. It's always exciting. These cars sound unbelievable. The racing is phenomenal. Like you're talking about, everything happens so fast paced, and the decisions that the drivers have to make are split second decisions. I mean, it's just constant overload of information at all times when they're driving. And you can see why a lot of famous and very successful NASCAR drivers have come out of sprint car racing. It's essentially, if you can race a sprint car and be successful in that, you can control and drive anything. And
this is all car control, right? To be able to move the car to a deterministic place on dirt that's constantly changing from underneath you.
Yeah, you have to manage the track. The track is always changing. Dirt is just a fascinating thing in general to be able to race on, where throughout the night, the track is changing. Throughout a race, the track is changing of where there's grip, where there isn't grip. And so there's so much more that develops within these drivers comparative to a lot of other forms of racing. And so it always surprised me of getting into road course racing and talking to these other people that were very much into motorsports, into racing, loved to travel and race cars, almost knew nothing or had never been to a sprint car race. And for me, I'd always, looked at it as like, oh, well, this is like the pinnacle. This is the peak. Like, these guys are true diehard motorsport fans and drivers to the purest form. And if we look at America in general, in regards to motorsports, there are significantly more dirt tracks, dirt oval tracks, than there are road courses. It makes sense, right? I mean, you can make a dirt track a lot easier than you can make a paved road course circuit. And so that means that, like, these small town dirt track communities are so alive and well. And sprint cars, for the most part, are that series that all of these people that are running these local dirt tracks want to get into. And so sprint cars are pretty much, I would argue, are the most popular or most common form of race car in the United States. And that's what kind of makes it this cool and like thriving motorsport environment and community, is because it happens all across the country. And so once again, I was so surprised that road course racers never knew anything about this. And for the most part, if you live in America, I'm sure that there's a dirt track somewhere in your backyard that you can go and check this stuff out. And I can guarantee you that you will not be disappointed if you go watch sprint cars or even just anything on dirt on an oval. It's exciting. It is unbelievable, the showmanship that gets put on, even in these small towns.
I mean, for the most part, televised motorsports sticks to pavement. Right, you see very little televised motorsports that involves dirt to start. So getting exposure and experience here, it's something that there's plenty of people who are out there doing it, but maybe it's not the highlight or the glamorous thing where you're going to see all the big sponsors, the companies you're most familiar with for motorsports. But around 100 total road courses exist in the U.S. Maybe it's a little bit more than that, around 120 paved proper road courses these days. Well, there's well over 700 dirt tracks in the U.S., ovals, circle tracks, and the like, that are supporting sprint car racing and other forms of racing like it. So almost an order of magnitude more venues to go see this stuff. It exists out there. It's just you need to maybe look a little harder if you're not right near one. But you can almost be guaranteed that there's probably one not too far from where you are. It's kind of cool. And some of the dirt tracks, I think, that have, I'll say, stuck their head up and got the sort of notoriety that some of the paved road courses have gotten are places like Calistoga that we talked about. Bristol has a dirt course that's very well known. Knoxville is where there's national racing for sprint car races every year. Eldora is another one of those tracks that's a really well-known dirt track. And it brings out the big names. You had mentioned NASCAR and drivers from other series having gotten their start or their experience in sprint car driving. You have folks like Tony Stewart, or Kyle Larson, who are very well-known racers in NASCAR, in drag racing, in IndyCar. And these are guys who got their start and continue to be involved with sprint car racing on dirt.
Yeah, even Jeff Gordon. I mean, Jeff Gordon was a Northern California. You got to start in sprint cars. It's kind of cool that these like dinky little dirt tracks that you wouldn't think of anything were the proving grounds for these superstars in motorsports that we all know nowadays. Kyle Larson is still so involved in sprint cars that he even started his own sanctioning body called High Limit. Now, that is kind of the new marquee series to go and run because, I mean, any marquee series to run sprint cars is the one that can pay out the most amount of prize money. And so High Limit is all about, big purses, and that's bringing out these big teams and these big names to put on these massive events. And so sprint car racing, thankfully, is still very much alive, especially on the professional level. They're still putting on marquee events and doing these unbelievable things. So, I mean, like, look more into it of, like, these big races that happen. And I can tell you that going and seeing a sprint car race in person is significantly better than watching it on television. Most other forms of motorsports, it's almost better to watch it on TV than it is to go in person just because of the view and like what you can watch. In regards to sprint cars, television does not do it justice. It reduces the speed. Like if you're there in person, smelling the fuel, hearing the cars, getting covered in dirt, it's a totally different experience that is so much better live than it is on television. Now, some other things to talk about with sprint cars is it's not only just America. This is not just an American sport. This is pretty international as well. So sprint car racing is actually also really popular in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So a lot of these big famous US sprint car drivers will actually travel to Australia to go run sprint cars there. So like people like Kyle Larson, Rico Abreu, those individuals, like they'll actually travel for sprint car racing as well. So it's kind of cool that it's like this internationally recognized thing as well.
Yeah, and if the names of these racetracks or speedways don't roll off your tongue, well, give a listen, because we're going to tell you about some of them, at least out here on the west coast of the U.S. These exist everywhere. We talked about the Knoxville Nationals. There's a big race every year, especially think for the midgets that they call the Chili Bowl that happens in Oklahoma, right around the middle of the country. But here in Northern California, we have Calistoga, we have Petaluma Speedway, we have the Stockton Dirt Track, we have Antioch, Placerville, there's Ocean Speedway out in Watsonville near Santa Cruz. I didn't even know about that one. Kevin Harvick, of course, who we know from NASCAR fame, has got his Kern Raceway. We have Paris Auto Speedway down near Riverside in California. Up in the Northwest, we've got Willamette Speedway in Oregon. We've got Skagit in Washington, where there's a big national event that happens every year. So these places are all over the map. And if you just pay a little bit closer attention or maybe look in some of the less traveled places in terms of big cities, you'll find these speedways, you'll find these dirt tracks, and you'll find a thriving community of racers, spectators, fans, people involved in supporting these races and sponsoring them all around.
Go support your local dirt track and watch a sprint car race.
So I wanted to learn a little bit more about this space. I took the advantage of the opportunity to go see one locally. I got to see some things I never even could have anticipated in any way. And I heard a lot of terminology about things that I didn't fully understand. Like I'm just getting to know about oval racing on pavement, right, for NASCAR and IndyCar, let alone on dirt. And there's a whole set of dynamics that are just different in driving on the dirt. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of terminology overview, a little primer on what to expect if you're going to go out to the dirt track. And maybe, Sylas, you can help fill in some of these gaps for me because I'm still learning what this stuff is. But I heard the term cushion a lot. And I got the sense that this was sort of like the curb or the edge of the dirt where cars were running. But like, tell me about the cushion. What is that?
So the cushion is something that has to develop. And so we talked about dirt tracks that they change over time. And so as the car will run through a groove, it's going to start pushing dirt up to the top part of the turn, so the top part of the banking. Now, over time, that dirt can start to get compacted, and so you'll see, like, there's a part where the track looks smoother, and then up towards the top, there'll be kind of like stacks of mud clods.
Like a little berm up there.
Right, and so that'll develop what you'll call a cushion, where it's kind of this, like, bumper or a buffer. And so if you can run the top end of the corner and you can run the cushion will actually
help you turn,
grab the car and will give you grip. So it's kind of like leaning on a wall, but it's a wall of dirt with the tire. but you don't want to blow through the cushion. So you can blow through the cushion, meaning you come in so hot that the cushion can't catch the momentum of the car. You'll blow through the cushion. You'll get out into the marbles past the cushion, that's all that loose dirt, or you're just smacking the wall. So the cushion is the top part of the track that develops that you can utilize for a little bit of extra grip. It's basically like this curb or wall, small wall of dirt that forms and can catch the car.
Okay, and so you mentioned marbles. That's familiar to me as a road course racing. That's the offline place where there's a lot of gravel or little bits and it's not as compacted in or as rubbered in, so you don't want to be driving out there. You mentioned the groove. I get the sense that that's the line you're supposed to be driving through the dirt, right? So on a racing surface that was paved, you'd have that rubbered in, what they would call the line. But here on dirt, the line is changing all the time, but for a little while it sort of establishes itself in what they call the groove. Is that right?
Right, and it changes, the groove changes. It's basically the preferred method through the corner. Now, if the dirt track is prepped well, there is more than one groove. So you can run the top groove, which is on the top side of the corner, or the bottom groove. And that's what makes for really good racing. If you can run down low, the bottom groove, as well as the top groove, that's where you can get kind of like side-by-side action. There's more passing. Now, if it's a single groove track, meaning there's only one preferred line through the corner, that's where you'll get a lot of, single file racing, not as exciting. You'll have to throw a slide job to be able to overtake a car if there's a single groove, where if it's a double groove track, you can run the bottom to try to pass the guy that's running the top.
Okay, so if I caught that one, the slide job that you mentioned, that's kind of like throwing the car into the corner kind of low and letting the vehicle sort of drift upward higher into the corner to like make a pass happen?
Yeah, in road course racing, people might think about this like a dive bomb without hitting the car that you're going in front of. So
Right.
A slide job might be throwing the car down to the bottom groove with amount of speed that you cannot hold the bottom groove. So you're going to take the bottom line, but you're going to throw in a bunch of momentum, a bunch of speed that's going to slide you back up to that top groove. Now, if you perform a slide job correctly, you should be able to clear the car that you're trying to pass as you get to that top groove. A slide job is the guy's running the top line or the top groove. You're going to dive down to the inside of the corner, down to the bottom groove, but with such momentum, it's going to slide you back to the top in front of that other car.
So you start up high up, you're going to dive down below, and it's going to slide you back up to the top.
Exactly. And so
Okay.
if a successful slide job is you throw it in with enough momentum that you're going to clear that other car as you get to the top groove or the top part of the track. Now, if you do an incorrect slide job, you're either going to slide into the guy, right? If you mistime it or don't have enough momentum, or, that guy gets around you and you've lost a bunch of momentum. So it's basically a way to overtake that. You're going to go, as you're coming into the corner, dive down to the inside, almost touch basically the apron down in the bottom of the corner, and then slide up in front of that other guy.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about, there's the high side, the low side, and the apron. So the apron is sort of that like paved section on the inside of the racetrack, right where the dirt ends?
Sometimes it's paved. Most of the time it's not. It's basically, the apron is essentially where the banking kind of becomes flat. Now, there's other tracks where the apron is fair game, right? That even that flat part of the track, you can get down there, right? In dirt racing, there really is no limits or track limits. In some tracks, they'll put like curbing or tires or like some sort of barrier to prevent you from going too far to the inside. But that apron is just kind of the transition from the banking to flat. Most of the time, it's still dirt. Everything's dirt.
Got it. Okay, and then I heard the term backing it in, and I think that was specific to the non-wing cars. So does that mean the cars are actually entering the corner sort of rear first?
In some cases, yeah. Depending on how the track is hooked up or not hooked up, when you come into the corner, you're basically pitching that car as soon as you turn it in. That's what's going to rotate the car. So it's these kind of like gnarly snaps in the very beginning of the corner that then sets the car at its proper slip angle or drift, as most people would think about it. And so, yeah, backing it in is just essentially like throwing in a bunch of angle to make it through the corner. And that all depends on track conditions.
Yeah, and so we saw this water truck that came around in between the heats that we were watching, and it would come and wet down the track. So I guess with dirt and it's constantly moving underneath the cars and establishing these grooves and so forth, they'll come and they'll add some moisture to it, and then that changes the dynamics all over again.
Yeah, it's so weird to think about, like in dirt track racing, adding moisture adds grip. So when I say it's hooked up, that means there's a lot of grip in the dirt. Now, as dirt starts to dry out and get dusty, it'll become slipperier. And so you want this like appropriate amount of moisture mixture to be able to get the track fast, which makes it more exciting. And you want to develop multiple grooves. And so there's a whole science, which is way above my mental capacity, of like how to manage the dirt on a dirt track. There's different types of dirts at different types of tracks, which make them really good or really bad or whatever the case is. And so, yeah, the moisture content of the dirt really adds to the dynamic of the track. So the drier the track, the slipperier it is, the slower the cars are going to go. The more moisture that's in the dirt, the more tacky it is, the more the cars can get hooked up, the faster they can go, the more exciting the racing's going to be.
When we first got out to Calistoga Speedway, there was a lot of dust in the air. You could see that they were driving around on the track, and a lot of the particulate was just coming up off the track. And then in between those sessions, they came out with the water truck and put down some water, and then they went out to race again, and it was much less dusty. So I guess as an artifact of that adding grip to the track, it also doesn't kick up as much of that dirt.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of cool from like a team perspective, is how you set up these cars. Throughout the night, the track is constantly changing. Like you might start qualifying, around 3, 4 p.m., but your main event might not be until 9 p.m. And throughout those hours, there's other series going on track and running and stuff like that. Things are always constantly changing. And that's what's kind of cool when you watch these big events during the heat races, and as the racing's going on through the night, you'll watch drivers watch other races just to see how the track is changing throughout the evening. Where are people running? Where is the grip? There's so much more like process or thought process that goes into like, how am I going to run this corner? We think about ovals and we're like, how hard can it be? You just turn left. There's essentially 2 corners. In NASCAR, they call it 4 corners, right? Turn 1's the entry, turn 2's the exit, turn 3's the entry of the other one, turn 4's the exit of the other one. But there's so much dynamic that occurs, that changes, and your line of what we think in road course racing as the ideal line is constantly changing in sprint car racing.
Yeah, and then when you add the wings on top, you add this whole other aerodynamic downforce kind of management of the air aspect to all of this, in addition to trying to manage the ground underneath your tires. So we have this idea of clean air and dirty air, right? So if you're the car that's out front, you're sort of unobstructed by other cars. You're the one that's punching a hole through the air in front of all the rest of the pack. And let's say now you're behind some other car, you're in the dirty air, which is to say all of the disruption of air that's happening as air flows over this car as it kicks up other air makes it harder for the cars behind, who have all these aerodynamic devices on their cars, to take advantage of that air for their own grip.
Right, and we've heard that terminology of dirty air in F1, NASCAR, all that sort of stuff. But I think you were amazed at like how much air sprint cars push around, especially with those big wings. It makes sense, right? It's a massive wing. It's got to be pushing around a lot of air. But at Calistoga, going into 1, the trees are kind of overhanging where the catch fence is. And as those cars would come into turn 1, you would just watch the trees basically get blown over, like there's almost like a hurricane coming of how much air that is moving around these vehicles.
I couldn't believe how much of that was coming off of the cars. Like at first I thought, hey, it's getting kind of windy out here. But then I realized the cars would go the other 3/4 of the way around the track, and the trees were still. There wasn't motion at all. It wasn't the wind blowing at all. It was all of the wind coming off of these cars, all of the air washing over the wings on these cars as they drove by, as they made this sort of whipping through the air. Those trees were kicking around, like you said, like there was a storm going on. I just couldn't even imagine how much actual wind there was that was getting, sort of disrupted by these cars. And then I've seen some footage. I didn't see this quite up close and personal, but there's this like vapor trail that effectively forms underneath the wing of the sprint car because there's like these vortices that occur as a result of the condensation in the air as they drive by.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of people think about sprint cars as a bunch of rednecks. Like there is a decent amount of engineering that goes into these vehicles. And yeah, depending on the moisture in the air, you can see the vortices coming off of the top wing and even the front wings. I mean, they're pushing an ungodly amount of air. And with these cars, with how much horsepower they have and how fast they're going through the corners, you need as much downforce as you could possibly get. So, I mean, they're pretty wicked machines. And those wings, so those top wings, there are adjustability in those wings, not like the DRS that we know in F1. They don't move like that, but they can slide. So the whole top wing is actually on a rail system, and there's adjustment in the cockpit of the vehicle that you can slide the wing forward, which will make it more flat and move it forward in the vehicle, or you can slide it back, which can add more angle to the wing and move where the downforce would be further to the rear of the vehicle. So this adjustment in the wing not only can make the car faster down the straightaway, reducing the drag on the vehicle, but can also change the balance of how much the car is going to turn into the corner, how much sideways essentially it's going to get in the corner, and all that stuff. And so you're almost trying to like trim out your wing as much as possible, especially on like the higher speed tracks, without losing control in the corners. So it's kind of cool that they even have adjustability for those wings.
It was quite impressive just to watch them managing these cars get around the track. I couldn't imagine also having to manage the dynamics of the angle of the wing on top of the car while you're partway through a lap and then having to change it again for the next part of the lap. It was so exciting. You know, motorsports is a big enough tent that we can include all this stuff in it. And so slightly to take the point of view of somebody who just saw dirt and was excited by it and sort of wants to embrace it and learn more about it and go see more. I love this quote that I heard from some sprint car drivers. They say, asphalt is meant for getting there. Dirt is for racing.
That's pretty good. That's pretty solid.
So if you want to go see some sprint car racing, let's say you're in the kind of areas where we've been talking about, there's something called the Open Wheel Oktoberfest that's happening. The NARC Series King of the West is going to be occurring in October at Antioch. They're doing something called Track or Treat at Kevin Harvick's Kern Raceway at the end of October. I think it's the 25th. And then there's the Kubota High Limit Racing Series that's going to be in the All-In Championship weekend at Texas Motor Speedway Dirt Track in mid-October as well. So there's a lot of this stuff going on right now. This doesn't even look further out in the calendar. This is just what's going on the next few weeks. If you're anywhere near this stuff and you have an inkling at all, if what we've been talking about has excited you or maybe made you curious about these things, go see it. As somebody who didn't know before and now they've seen the light and now they want to get closer to it, I can only endorse this so much. You need to go take the next steps and get out to a sprint car race, get up close and personal with these things, take in the experience and see if it does for you what it did for me.
Yeah, I got to give you props for being willing to go out there and check out Calistoga Speedway. It was awesome to be able to introduce you to that form of motorsport, something that I grew up watching and really enjoying. And every time I have the opportunity to go to a dirt track, I always love it and I enjoy it. There's an aura of it, of a night race at a dirt track that just nothing else compares to. And so it was really cool to share that experience with you. And hopefully we get to go to another sprint car race here shortly.
Yeah, thanks for having me along for that. And thanks to you and Tim Barber for being such great hosts and kind of pointing out the way for a newbie to figure out what was actually going on out there. I guess if I had advice for anybody, be prepared to get a little dirty, right? The dirt does kick up from the track, and we had the best vantage point in the house. We were inside the racetrack, so you get what's called a pit pass, and you're able to go into the inner part of the racetrack where all the teams are set up doing their pit crew work, preparing their cars, doing maintenance and modifications on those cars during the races themselves, in between the heats. It was such a cool experience to be up close and personal and so open. You could walk up to any team, any car that was out there, take a look, get some pictures. People were friendly. They wanted to talk about their stuff. It was such a cool scene. I'm so glad I had an opportunity to do it, and I really appreciate you guys hosting me and showing me a good time.
Well, thanks, Todd. This has been a fun conversation.
Thanks, Sylas. What a blast. Get out and go see some sprint racing.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.